And if we take just the writings of the early church fathers, which are those people who are a generation after the apostles, then just from their quotations, we can compile almost the entire New Testament that they considered authoritative. So already at the end of the first century, the Christians knew which books were authoritative, or to use our word now, which books were inspired. Play historian for a moment, and imagine that you're trying to figure out about some event that happened in 500 AD, okay, 500 years after Christ's birth. It's your job to figure out if this event happened or what it was like when it happened, okay? So you find a source from 540, 40 years after the alleged event, that says in the year 500 there was an earthquake that killed 50 people, okay? You're playing good historian. You have another source that's dated in 650, so 150 years later, which still historically, by the way, is very soon, very quick. You find another source that's dated 150 years later that says there was an earthquake in 500 and it killed 500 people. Now, which source is more reliable? Being a good historian, the one who's earlier is considered in general more reliable because it's closer to the event itself. Okay, so in general, an earlier source is better than a later source. Now let's imagine that you have 5 sources in the 500s that all say the earthquake in 500 AD killed 50 people. And you have one source 150 years later that says it killed 500. Then it's considered virtually fact that it killed 50 people and not 500. And think about how insane it is that we still have texts, sources from the first century that date that far back, or even the second century. So if you found one source, one text that said an earthquake happened in 50 AD, then you would have good reason to believe that an earthquake probably happened in 50 AD, unless you had some reason to believe that this guy was lying for some reason. If you find 2 sources, 2,000 years later, 2 sources that point to that earthquake, then it's considered virtually fact that this earthquake occurred, because why would 2 different sources mention the earthquake if it didn't happen? With Christianity, we have the earliest sources and the most multiple sources that talk about what happened in the Bible. And I don't know if you knew this, right? People talk about, well, aren't there books that the Bible didn't include? Right? What about the Shepherd of Hermas? What about the Gospel of Peter? What about the Gospel of Thomas? What about the Gospel of Matthias? All those books exist, by the way. And they'll say something like, well, the Christians or Constantine was just picking the ones that he liked. But in reality, you want to know how many books we have that are dated in the first century? 27. You know which ones they are? The 27 that you have is the New Testament. So if you were just to be a historian and not a Christian, the 27 books that would be considered most accurate are the 27 books you have in the New Testament. And they already had those books and were passing them around as historical or authoritative books by the end of the first century. Certainly by the end of the second century when there's a much more full list. Now, it's true that there was some debate about 3 or 4 books about whether they should be included up until the end of the 3rd century, at least until the mid-3rd century, 4th century, the 300s. But the large majority of the Bible was already compiled, and they were considering those things authoritative. And in fact, there were a few books that weren't included, and it wasn't really the opposite way around. Okay. The basic idea is what makes a book, and this in general, what makes a book authoritative is it was connected to an apostle in some meaningful sense. The last apostle died in AD 90. There have been no more books added to the canon after the apostles died. Okay, next question. And again, if you have thoughts or comments or questions, please write them down. I will come to them in the end. You'll have a chance in the end. Just make sure you jot down something to help you remember what the question was, and then we'll come to all those. Secondly, how can we know that the Bible we have today is a reliable record of the original writings? I had a professor in college at Troy University in my undergrad who got people up and described the passage of the Bible, because he hated Christianity. He described the passage of the Bible as the game Telephone. You played that game as a kid, where one person says, the monkey went to the store and got a banana and 3 coconuts, and he passes to the next one. And then by the time you get to the last person, it's nothing like what the first person said. And he said, see, you can't trust your Bibles. How could you possibly? It hadn't just been 10 people. It's been 2,000 years of passed down from people. How could you possibly think that what you have in your hands in 2020, or 2007 when that was, is the same as what they wrote in the first century? That sounds pretty good to the freshman who doesn't know what he's talking about and know anything about things. And that experienced a lot of doubt that semester because of that professor. But the reality is that the way the Bible was passed down is nothing like the AIM telephone. In fact, we still have, today, Greek manuscripts that go back parts to the end of the 1st century and then others in the 2nd century. So we're not talking about translation of translation of translation of translation. We're talking about translation, which we do all the time. It's one translation from the Greek manuscripts that we still have, and we still have people that can read Greek, into what we now have as the Bible, particularly the New Testament. The Old Testament, by the way, there's virtually no question, and that's because of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the early 20th century, which confirmed that what we have now is the same thing the Jews were reading before Christ, which is incredible. But we know the same thing is true in the New Testament as well, because the sources we have are far too close to the events themselves for fake things to have been brought into the text, and there's far too many copies. So it isn't like we have one copy. We have thousands of copies, and we have many, many that are that ancient. So it's not like the AIM telephone at all. It's like the AIM telephone for the first 2 people, and then that's about it. Okay, third one. What major contradictions exist in the Bible? None. That's the answer. Every alleged contradiction has reasonable explanations to harmonize the things, harmonize what's being called a contradiction. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, what the deal is that we don't understand how they wrote in the 1st century or how they wrote in ancient Israel, how they wrote history compared to how we write history, and there's just variations. They don't write history the same way we did it. The way we do it's fairly modern, where it's literally about the statistics have to be exactly, and it's different the way we do it than they did it. And so there's some alleged contradictions that go with that, but they're not contradictions at all. Something you hear very common is something like in all the manuscripts we have that there are 600,000 errors in the manuscripts. 600,000 errors in the thousands of manuscripts we have, which is true, by the way. But what we mean by errors is, like if there's a comma at the wrong place, that's actually the majority of them, is a misplaced comma, or if there's a spelling error, or if somebody put one letter, they meant to put B, but they put D. That's not Greek, but you understand what I'm saying. Very small errors, and not one of the most skeptical, like Bart Ehrman, who's a non-Christian New Testament scholar, will admit that none of the 600,000 errors change anything about doctrine, change anything about Christian truth. So none is the answer. All right, next one. Does the Bible support slavery? Why or why not? Does the Bible support slavery? Why or why not? It's a more complicated question than it may seem, but the answer is no. There are slaves mentioned in the Bible, and we don't have anyone ever come out and say, get rid of all slaves forever. That slavery is itself always wrong. We don't have that sort of clear statement that we would like in 21st century America. But here's what we need to realize is that when we think of slavery, what we have in mind is something different than what slavery has been throughout mankind's history. Virtually every society that's ever been has had slaves of some kind because there wasn't bankruptcy laws back then. So if you went in ultimate debt, you became an indentured servant. There weren't ways to get you out of those situations. A lot of the slaves in countries were prisoners of war, so men who were soldiers who got captured and they become slaves in the foreign country. So it's not slavery that you think of, which is bound up with race and ethnicity and the utter brutality that was the transatlantic slave trade. The slaves, you can read it in the Old Testament. Slaves had the opportunity, if they enjoyed being in their master's house, to stay, and often that was a case taken up. Imagine if it's estimated that a third of the Roman population was slaves. We're talking about millions of people. Imagine if Paul would have done what we want him to do and say, all slaves must be freed tomorrow. What you end up with is at best people who are doomed to poverty, and at worst people who are doomed to death, as they have no means of establishing themselves in this sort of society. This isn't America, right, where we're providing for the homeless. So there's lots of answers, lots of reasons for this. But let me say this. The only reason you think slavery is wrong is because of Christianity. No one has thought slavery was wrong ever until Christians came along and started reading Genesis 1 and saying, hold on, all of us have been made in the image of God? Hold on, all of us come from the same race? Hold on, there's no reason at all to think one race is better than another? That there's no such thing really as races biblically, except the human race that we all are? That all these differences are just superficial? Certainly not based on our value? If you weren't a Christian, or if you didn't live in a culture that had been so impacted by Christianity as the modern world has, You would think of slavery the way everyone else has thought of slavery. Well, look, they're just weaker. They lost. It's the deal they got, etc. But you see slavery as an inherent evil because of the Christian worldview. And let me say this in final. It's important to know this, especially in our modern world. Christ's goal when he came to earth was not social justice. It was not to make sure that the Roman government was handled correctly politically. It was to save sinners. My kingdom is not of this world. So, social justice, good things will happen as a result of people loving Christ, but his goal was not to do that. His goal was always spiritually, and so too is ours, by the way. Our goal is always a spiritual goal primarily, and the physical things come downstream of that. So, does the Bible support slavery? No. Does it outright condemn slavery? No, but we need to change our categories of thinking about what it means to be a slave. What we're talking about in the ancient Bible, in the ancient world, and in any world is not what you think of, which is inherently racist and all those things. Okay. Does the Bible support rape? And that's kind of a new one. It's relatively new, at least on a popular basis. And the idea is that David raped Bathsheba, and God gave the thumbs up to it. That's the basic idea. But the Bible is abundantly clear that rape is sinful. In fact, if you raped a woman in the Old Testament, you were to be stoned. There are additional laws that if a man, there's a law that says even if a man entices a woman and sleeps with her, and it's not the same language as rape, that he just entices her, the man convinces her to sleep with him, he must, by Jewish Old Testament law, give her the opportunity of marriage, to offer marriage. Her family can say no because they don't think it's a good fit or whatever. But what can happen is she is defiled and then becomes, in large part, unmarriable. This man will take care of her unless she doesn't want him to take care of her. So there were the laws, the Old Testament laws, especially of ancient Mesopotamia, are incredibly radical when it comes to how women are to be treated. And that continues in the New Testament. The women in the New Testament in the first century were flocking to the Christian church where they were being treated as equals in a way that they weren't until really relatively recently, historically. Okay, along that lines, does the Bible support human sacrifice? Think Abraham and Isaac is where this primarily comes from. No, unshockingly. God, very often in the Old Testament, is wiping out nations precisely because of child sacrifice. One of the main sins we get from the Canaanites and other cultures like that is that they were offering their children to foreign gods, often Molech, or somebody, I think Mark mentioned last week that the popular one that we know of historically is that Molech had his two arms out, and they would burn those, they would light those arms, a fire underneath those arms until they got hot enough, and they would place the babies on these arms, and the baby would die instantly as being burned alive. That these cultures were doing this, and this is one of the primary reasons given for why Israel was sent in to be God's judgment on them. Also, as we've looked at in our series in Genesis, Abraham and Isaac is a story primarily that foreshadows Christ. And when Abraham went to kill Isaac, he knew God was going to raise him from the dead, Hebrews 11. He expected God to raise him from the dead. He knew God would fulfill his promise of bringing him a nation through Isaac. And so what he expected to happen was, on the third day, after he had journeyed to the place, that Isaac would die and would rise from the dead because of Christ. So that story is often taken out of context as if God commanded child sacrifice, when really all that's happening is just hey, here's what's going to happen with Christ in a few thousand years, in a really magnificent way, which we looked at a few weeks ago. And then, important question, which I got at a little bit a minute ago, if there is no God, right, which is the common position of people asking these questions. Not always. Sometimes it's Christians asking good questions, and that's great. But if there is no God, slavery isn't wrong, human sacrifice isn't wrong, rape isn't wrong. Those things happen in the animal kingdom all the time. All of them happen in the animal kingdom all the time. And if all we are animals, then the strong survive, which is the base of us if there is no God. And without God, there can be no real objective morality, real right and real wrong. It's just kind of what you feel like in the moment. Hitler wasn't wrong to him, or wrong in the ultimate sense. We just don't like what Hitler did if there is no God. But of course there is. By the way, I've mentioned this before, but very interestingly, in the first couple of centuries, Christians were thought of as cannibals and as atheists, which one of the many times that we have been mischaracterized and still are all the time. That's because they misunderstood communion, where we eat the flesh and drink the blood of Christ. So they thought we were cannibals actually doing that. And they called us atheists because we only worshiped one God and didn't worship the Roman gods. Okay. I'm not going to answer that one. I will. It's just, how do Christians determine what parts of the Bible are prescriptive and what parts are descriptive? Meaning, how do we know what parts of the Bible are just describing to us what happened and what parts are telling us how we should act? Lots of work. That's part of my primary job, preparing a sermon, is figuring those things out. But there's lots of things that go into that. In general, this is not sweeping, in general, the Old Testament is descriptive, describing to us the things that happened with Israel. The New Testament is prescriptive, telling us about how we should behave on this side of Christ. But it's more than that, looking at context and how have the Christians in the past seen it, looking for principles instead of just practices. A good example of this is 1 Timothy 2, where it talks about women not wearing braided hair. We know that that's not about the braided hair itself. It's about, it could be about various things, but the basic idea is that it's about dressing immodestly. That's a principle that we take, and we say, okay, well, there's a principle there, though the practice itself is descriptive. Okay, fun stuff. The earth, young earth versus old earth. Here's my answer. Is the earth old or is the earth young? Yeah, yeah, it is. Here's where I think we have erred in the past, is drawing really dark lines with Sharpie when this question and say you have to be one or the other to be a Christian. And I don't think that's the case. You're free to think that's the case, by the way, and think I'm wrong on that. But I think there's good reasons on both sides, and there's good evidence on both sides. I think it's fine inside of the faith window to be a young earth creationist, 6 to 10,000 years, old earth creationist, which goes with whatever the scientific dating is currently. The key issues in the whole debate are Genesis 1 through 11. How do you see Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 11, which we talked about in our series a bit, particularly, of course, Genesis 1. Just a very short example of argumentation that's made. Young earth creationists, a good argument is Exodus chapter 20, seems to take the 7-day creation and applies it to our 7 days. So it sees the 7 days as literal 7 days, it applies it over to our 7 days. God's 7th day of creation, he rested, we rest on our 7th day. And then on the other side, old earth would say something like, well, Genesis 1 is not meant to tell us history, that the Bible, the Old Testament, the Genesis first chapters certainly don't tell us everything. They're just aimed at telling us theological things. And we know that because we have no idea where Cain's wife came from. She could have come from Adam and Eve, of course, which is the traditional answer. She was just one of the children. But we're not told about it, right? She just appears out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden there's cities, and we didn't know cities were even being built. We just knew Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And all of a sudden there's cities, and there's women, and there's people, and there's all kind of stuff. So the point of that just being that the aim of Genesis 1 and following is not to tell us exactly how the world was created in history and all those things, but the aim is to tell us certain theological truths about God and about ourselves. You can believe either one of those and be a faithful Christian. I believe that firmly, but if you think you've got to be one or the other, you're welcome to hold that view and agree to disagree even about that. Okay, evolution. Foundational thing first. Very often, science and faith are pitted against each other, as if they are enemies, as if they are rivals, as if they teach opposite truths. And in their truest form, of course, they do not. The whole foundation of science, that is, the whole beginning of the scientific method, began with a bunch of Christians who were convinced that the universe could be understandable because it was created by an intelligent God. All of them, the founders of science, began science largely because of their Christian worldview. In fact, Stephen Meyer, who, in my opinion, is one of the 5 most important Christians in the world currently, if you want to look him up, Stephen Meyer argues in his book, Return to the God Hypothesis, that if it wasn't for Christianity, the scientific method never would have gotten off the ground. We've had people forever. The scientific method is very recent historically. It came, in fact, right after the Protestant Reformation is when the scientific method became a thing. But the ground from which science sprang was the ground of Christianity, that believed that God had created the universe, that the universe could be understood, and that if we studied the universe, we'd learn more about our God. Right, there's been 2 kind of basic ways of understanding how we can learn about God. The first one being the book of Scripture, and the second one being the book of nature. That might be Newton who said that. But the book of Scripture and the book of nature, meaning that Romans chapter 1, God has taught us about himself some things, nothing clearly, like in Scripture, of course, but we can learn about God from his creation. That's what science is when it's at its best, looking at the creation of God to see what we can learn about God from that creation. That's what it was certainly initially. So I say that to say, don't be scared of science. Science isn't the enemy. When it's done well, it's teaching us about God. And that's a wonderful and beautiful thing. We have learned much about the universe that God created from science, and we should be very thankful for that. Natural revelation. Okay, now, evolution. I'm not an expert by any means, but so I couldn't answer all of your questions. But basically what evolution is it just means a change of traits across generations. Okay? A change of traits across generations. And there's two main things for you to know about evolution to understand it as a worldview. Number one is random mutation, which means when DNA is passed from generation to generation, of whether it be amoeba or human, when DNA is passed, the DNA doesn't copy exactly. So there'll be little things in the DNA that are different than the parent's DNA. And then the new DNA, when it replicates, when it procreates, it will pass on that new DNA mutation. And mutation sounds bad, like X-Men or something, but it just means a change in DNA. And so that change would just be passed on from generation to generation. That's what the idea of random mutation is. Now, the easiest example of this, though it's not random, of course, but the easy example is dogs, right? There were no dogs that fit in purses like 200 years ago. Like a very short time ago, there weren't dogs that would fit in a purse. Maybe more than 200, but you understand the point. How has that occurred? Just randomly? Like Chihuahuas started popping up? How did we make poodles so small? Right? How have we made mini everythings? Well, the answer is we take the dwarf of the runt and then we breed it with the other dwarf. Right? We take the smallest ones who have DNA built for smallness and we breed them continually to the detriment of the breed, of course. But that's what we do. Right? We take the ones who are different than the rest of the litter, the different that we like, and we breed that with another one that's different the same way. And then they tend to produce the same kind of dog, and eventually you get smaller and smaller and smaller, and we tossing them like a coin soon enough, it seems. Okay, so there's that. Random mutation. So the DNA changes from generation to generation, and there can be slow change because of that. The second part of it is natural selection. So natural selection playing on random mutation. That's really the definition of evolution. Natural selection says that the best DNA traits will be the ones that will survive. And that's, again, kind of just obvious. And by the way, we're all for these things, or I am. We have every reason to believe these things are good and true and designed by God to work this way, incredibly. The idea is something like this. The examples, there's three common examples. I'll just give you one. Is the Galapagos, that island, those islands, and the turtles that live there, or tortoises that live on the Galapagos Islands. On those islands, we have tortoises are very popular on these islands, but there's different islands that have different qualities on the islands. And what we find is the tortoises that are on one island look a little different than tortoises on the other. Here's what I mean. On one island, there's a tortoise that has a short neck and a round body, and the things it eats are all over the ground. On another island, the things that tortoise eats are a little higher up in like small trees. And so these tortoises have longer necks and thinner shells for them to reach these things. Now, there's no reason to think that those tortoises were just that way always. But the idea is, and again, it's a good idea, it's not against God in any way. The idea is that there were tortoises on these islands, and then when the tortoises ended up on these islands, however it occurred, with the taller trees, the ones who survived were the ones who had a little bit longer necks. And so the longer neck tortoises would breed, and they would produce tortoises with a little bit longer necks. And so eventually you have tortoises that are noticeably longer in the neck area than the other tortoises because that helps them survive. That's basic, right? Microevolution. It's a beautiful thing, in fact. It's certainly the product of design, it seems. Other examples are like Darwin's finches or the moths in London. There's other things, but it's the basic idea that we adapt to survive over generations. Okay, no issues there theologically. That's just adaptation inside of species. There's good evidence for it. We don't have any reason to deny it. We can look at it as we should and say, what a God. What a God to create things to work that way. The issues start to come into play with the bigger ideas. And the bigger ideas are things like common ancestry, which is where we get the idea of the tree of life. As much as I love that song in The Lion King, this comes from the idea that life is like a tree, that it goes down to one point, and then from that one point comes everything, that everything has a common ancestor, hence the phrase common ancestry. Now, this part of the theory has much less evidence, is much more specious. In fact, Darwin knew there was a problem when he wrote his book. he just assumed that we would solve the problem as we discovered more fossils. But the opposite's happened. We've just made the problem infinitely greater than Darwin ever knew. We don't have anything in the fossil record that seems to imply common ancestry. Maybe, perhaps to a point, but that point is still very spread out compared to the one point that Darwin expected. Yeah, Stephen Meyer has great books on this if you like really academic things. One is called Signature in the Cell. One is called Darwin's Doubt, which is about that particular topic. I can point you to those if you'd like after this is over, if you want to go deeper. And let me say it like this. The philosophy that often comes behind evolution is that it is a blind, undirected, material process. If you just leave off the first two, you can be a Christian and hold it and not think that all those things happen blindly, which is honestly absurd. Beyond absurdity, to think that if the process was true in its entirety, that it would happen undirected is insane. But there's not evidence for the common ancestry nearly like there is for the adaptation. So not for macro like there is for microevolution. And then perhaps most importantly, evolution says nothing. Darwin said nothing. Evolution says nothing about the beginning of things, like the first life. People think it does. It doesn't. Remember Darwin's book? It was called The Origin of Species. Yeah, not the origin of life, because he had no idea. And evolution still has nothing to say about origins, about how the first living thing came to be. And Darwin thought that a cell was a pretty simple thing. It was just kind of goo with some stuff in it. And he thought, that's not a big deal. I mean, that could have come together in the oceans of the world. But we now, the further we go scientifically, the more complex the cell becomes. So much so that we don't have machines in the world nearly as complex as one individual human cell is. And so it's quite a problem to get the first cell and thus the first life. Okay, what are the key? I'm not going to answer that one. What are the theological implications of Adam and Eve being historical figures? Okay, so this is the thing that you need to know about if you don't. There's a modern movement in the secular world of trying to say that even in the Christian world, by the way, and I think this is a problem, and I don't often say that because I'm pretty open. I think this is a problem. There's a modern movement to say Adam and Eve weren't actually historical figures, but were more like narrative characters meant to portray those theological truths, but without being historical. Okay. The reason I think you have to hold on to a historical Adam and Eve inside of Christianity is because the New Testament seems to pretty clearly think of them as historical, including Jesus. Did you not read man and woman were created? You know what I'm talking about. And then Paul talks about it several times, Adam and Eve. Even Peter does in the latter half of the New Testament as well. So, and it seems like you need a historical Adam and Eve to make Romans 5, death in Adam, life in Christ, those kind of theological things make sense. So hold on to that. And really, my advice would be to hold everything else basically with a pretty loose hand and say, I don't know, we'll just see how it goes. Okay. Why would Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians differ on their view of the origin of the world? Because it's complicated and it's complex, and it's clear that Genesis 1, really through 11, but certainly chapter 1, is written in a different style than the rest of Genesis. We can acknowledge that. That's true. It may not mean anything, but it's true. And there's several chapters in the Bible that aren't meant to be taken what we would call literally, or in that sense historically. And it may be the case with Genesis 1. I don't know if it is or not, but it could be, and you can still be a Christian. Again, God gave us the book of Scripture and also the book of nature, and we can learn from both and still be faithful. All right. How can Christians believe miracles are possible? Because we believe God exists and is outside of all miracles. Science does not disprove miracles. Science has nothing to say about miracles. Because miracles happen above nature, and science can only deal with nature. So science can't say anything about miracles. And by the way, if you're interested, there is a lot of recent work in the last 15 years by Christian scholars on miracles in the modern world. Craig Keener wrote a massive volume just called Miracles, which is phenomenal, and there's more than that, of these documented, carefully documented cases of people who experience miracles that are unable to be explained materially. And I mean that in the strongest sense. If you're interested in that, those books would be worth your time. There's no doubt, in my opinion, you could even say scientifically, to use that phrase, that miracles are still occurring. All right. What does it mean biblically to have faith? How is it different than popular definition of faith? biblical faith is trust. It's like I said last week, it's the kind of belief that if someone came up to you on a beach and said, a massive tsunami is coming, it's going to kill everyone a mile inland, what you do from there says whether you believe it or not. Right? That's the kind of faith. If you stay on the beach, you don't have faith. You think they're lying. You think it's not true. But if you take off running, get your wife and kids, then that's because you believe it. Biblical faith is the kind of faith that by its definition then moves because it actually believes it. It actually believes Christ did that for me, and so I will live in a certain way, etc. So it's trust that leads to action. If Christianity is true, why are there so many Christians whose lives look no different than those of non-Christians? Great question. Parentheses, aren't many Christians hypocrites? Yes, I mean, we're all hypocrites in some sense, right? But it is true that there are people. We talked about how one of the Ten Commandments, do not take the name of the Lord God in vain. That idea is not really primarily about saying God, but the word take means the same thing it means now. It means carry. It means do not carry the Lord's name in vain. So it probably also means saying his name that sort of improper way. But the idea is that you are carrying God's name as if you are God's, and you have no intention of living that way. You're carrying the name in vanity. And there are people who are doing that and have always done that. There are people who have always carried the name of Christ with no intention of following him, carrying his name in vain. And that's just how it's going to be. We can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone's a Christian or that they're not. I think the church plays a role in saying we believe these are ours. We believe these members are Christians. You can trust that we think these people are Christians. I think the church plays a role in that. But there will always be Christians who don't live up to the call that we have been given. But that, of course, doesn't mean that Christianity isn't true. Imagine it like this. This is a Glenn Scrivener thing, if you know him. Imagine you, who's someone with good musical taste? I can't ask Chance. Is Dr. White in here? Dr. White, give me like your favorite classical musician. Mozart. Okay, that's a great one because we all know who that is. At least we heard about him once. Okay, so imagine you are going to take someone to hear Mozart for the first time. Okay, this kind of music that has caused people to worship for hundreds of years. You're going to bring them, and you bring them to the place to hear Mozart, and the band in front is a band of kids that have had their musical instrument for about 3 weeks. And if you've ever heard one of those bands, and I have, you know what that's like, right? It's a tough experience. That's a tough clap because you feel like you're lying, at the end of that. But you watch. Okay, now imagine you have a friend that you want to introduce to Mozart. You bring them to the show. When you leave the show, the friend says, "Man, Mozart is terrible." Right? That would be absurd because you didn't get a good idea of what that song was meant to be. You didn't get a good idea of what that symphony was. You have no idea what that song is and how it would move you if you saw it in its truest form. The reality is there have been a lot of Christians throughout history. Think of things like the Crusades. Think about the sexual sins of modern Big C church and all those things. There are Christians throughout who have done a very poor job of playing the song, if they played it at all. That doesn't mean the song isn't beautiful. You have to see the song. You need to see it for what it is in Christ and in his church when it is well. So we can't take the poor performance of the few and take it to conclude that the song and the songwriter are flawed. Why are there so many denominations? There's lots of reasons to be charitable. It's because the Bible is complex and people are trying to be faithful and they come to different interpretations and different conclusions. And that's okay. It's okay to come to different interpretations and conclusions about things. If we're submitted to Christ, then we can have some sort of fellowship and brotherhood. There are worse reasons than that, but we should try to be charitable when we can. Is Christianity responsible for millions of deaths throughout history? That's the same answer I just gave, the song thing. What has Christianity ever done? This is a modern idea that is so like it's when someone says what has Christianity ever done, it's like just pick up one history book, just read something of action. Christianity is the reason that our culture is as good as it is. The Christians invented hospitals thousands of years ago. The Christians invented orphanages. The Christians invented the university. That was a Christian idea, by the way. Harvard. How the mighty have fallen, right? Was it Christian university? The beginning ideas of the university was, let's teach these people the truths, capital T, about the universe so they can go out into the community and be God's people. Universities were our idea. Science, because of Christians. Scientific method, our idea. Human rights, totally from us. That's our thing. If you don't have Christianity, you have no reason to have human rights. You end up, you want to know what happens when you don't have human rights is the 20th century, where Hitler leads Germany, and Stalin leads Russia, and Mao leads China in the first ever secular societies, and they kill more people than have ever been killed in all the other centuries combined. Without Christianity, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a scholar of Christianity, but he was a prophet in that he said, if Christianity dies and we don't replace it with something as good, the world will die. And we have seen it try to do that, but Christianity thankfully hasn't died, and so the world hasn't died. And of course, goodness, art and music are almost entirely Christian. Not all. The large majority of great art for the last 2,000 years has been Christian in nature. The large majority of the great music of the last 2,000 years has been Christian in nature. What has Christianity done for the world? What happens to people who have never heard the gospel? I got 2 left, and I'm done. Whew! I'm gonna eat this cake after I'm done. What happens to people who have never heard the gospel? I don't know. No, I don't know is my best answer to that. Okay, maybe not my best. The best answer is God is going to do absolutely what is right, and in the end, you're going to agree with Him. There's more complicated answers. The truest, no one gets to heaven outside of Christ. Okay, that's absolutely true. No one gets to heaven outside of the blood of Christ. But there's tension and difficulty which we should acknowledge about, well, do you have to know the name Jesus? Because, the Old Testament saints didn't, right? But they were responding to God properly. You think of Romans 1, how the wrath of God is revealed against all unrighteousness, and by their unrighteousness suppress the truth, because what they know about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Right, so everyone knows about God in some sense. You think Romans 2, the Gentiles who know what the law is in their heart, who respond to it positively, or are seen in that light. So it's a more complicated question, really, how all that works. Here's where you need to rest with this thing. Whatever the right answer is what Christ is going to do, is what God is going to do. How all that's going to work is going to be up to Him. We could go really deep into this and different answers, different worldviews that are very interesting about how they answer these theodicy-type questions, but we don't have time for all that today, but I'm happy to do that in the future. And then, why don't miracles happen as frequently today as they did in the Bible? I don't know that they don't, number one, but let me just say, the Bible covers thousands of years, and if you look at it that way, there's not really that many miracles, right? We had this idea that we read the Bible, and that was like a 5-year period, and it was like, man, there's miracles every day. Like, no, this is over a lot of time, and the miracles are pretty spread out, so they weren't as common as you think. They tend to be clustered in a few areas, which is interesting, but along with that, the first thing that always comes to mind is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, many times, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but now He has spoken to us by His Son. So there is a sense in which, because of what we now know about Christ, miracles are less necessary than they were in the times where they were confirming the message and all those things. But I don't know that they're not happening as much. And again, see those books to that end. Okay. All right. Okay, your turn. Thoughts, comments, questions, remarks, disagreements, debates, additions, omissions, etc.